Okay, I'm ready when you are, Mark.
All right, well, let's forward march then.
Tank Park Stroll.
Tell me about your training as a tank soldier. And
Well, it started at the beginning, and basically I wanted to be responsible for my own activities, so I went to the Fleet Air Arm, but they were all in public school cadres, so I didn't stand a chance. And I went to the Air Force, and they only wanted rear gunners, and when I insisted on pilot or navigator, they thought I was a bit of a bullshit, I think, so I didn't get in there. But I got an undertaking from the Navy to call up for a General Service Commission, went on holiday and found myself in the Royal Armoured Corps, trained over here with them for 6 months and went on leave at Christmas, called back at Christmas, go to Liverpool on a draft. We missed the draft and we were there for 6 weeks in a frozen factory. Go to finish up in Abbasiyah barracks in Cairo with bugs pouring off the thing. Oh, terrible place. And do some training again and up to in the desert as recruits. And nobody owns you. You're on your own. You're the last people to get anything. But it was at the Ghazala line, and tanks were being knocked out. Crews came back to get new tanks and any other crews that are necessary. There were 2 of us left, Bill and I. And when we moved back, because the tank kept coming straight for us, a tiny tank with shells behind it, it was time to leave. And we went on the flat back to Alamein, but got dropped off from their lorry because it was overloaded. But we found our camp at Tobruk. Went on to the Alamein area, and eventually Bill and I, who'd been together for some time at training, decided to stick together, and we got together and went to the 5th Tanks. Our introduction to the 5th Tanks was quite memorable. I mean, we'd been short of all, so we'd suffered from what's the word?
Dehydration.
Dehydration. And one of the wags, we've got all our stuff, all our kit. One of the wags said, well, go over there, there's HQ. There were dunes. And we dragged our stuff over the top of this dune, and there was this thing in the bottom of this gully. And lo and behold, it was Paddy Doyle having a bath. Our mouths just off. Somebody having a bath in water? And he was clearly disapproving, and we eventually sorted ourselves out. But an immediate instruction went out that nobody was snooping around HQ anymore. So that's where I first met Paddy Doyle.
When you mentioned going to Abbasiyah barracks, I mean, were you badged to the Royal Tank Regiment at that point, or were you simply a recruit who could have gone anywhere?
At that time, the Tank Corps and Cavalry united, sort of. They were never united. And so it was called the Royal Armoured Corps. So until I joined the 5th Tanks, I was in the Royal Armoured Corps. I was lucky to be in the 5th Tanks.
But you had no choice in the matter, presumably. You were just flotsam on the sea of war.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it wasn't until you joined the unit you belonged. And rapidly you were part of the team, as it were.
You mentioned to me on the phone your first crew and how they were special to you.
Oh, yes.
Tell me a bit about that phenomenon and who those people were.
In the desert, 2 tanks were never together. They would be a target. We didn't have air supremacy. So you're all scattered on a good distance from each other. You rarely met all your troop, let alone all the squadron and the other squadrons. So you're very much on your own, and you cooked your own meals, you did everything together. And such was tank life that hopefully if you got hit, you'd sort each other out. And you got to know each other intimately. There was nothing else to talk about except family matters. Well, first of all, there was Bill, who was my best friend eventually. And he'd been to Manchester Grammar School, and he was like me. He wasn't going over commission. He was dead against it. And he and I had much in common. Then was Bill Yam. He was a Cumberland farmer. It was ages before I even understood him. And I once found him standing astride on the top of a wadi, looking down into the wadi and saying, bonny little spot yon with a little drop of water. Everything was farming to him. And he'd seen corn with several stalks of leaves, the stalks on one root. And all he wanted to do was get the last spot of land for toll folks. Marvellous hobwork, marvellous lad. And there was his friend, then Tomkinson. He was a bit of a non-entity. And there was Ben, who was the driver, who came from Tunbridge Wells, wrote a letter to his wife every night. And we had various tank commanders. The first one I had was the second in command of the troop, of the squadron, and he was in local government, so we had things in common. And we went off to collect a tank, replacement tank, the pepper pot, the skull. The turret was so welded, so many welded holes in it, we called it the pepper pot. And when we came back and went through the two minefields when Alamein started, he'd just been killed. So he was my first casualty, as it were. But we went all the way to very near Tunis together. And that's a lot of schmozzles.
A lot of mileage.
Mm.
You said to me that with the first crew or the first people you met, you got close to them in a way that you didn't subsequently allow yourself to get close to others. Is that right? Or have I misunderstood?
Well, no. When they were all around in Italy, and initially in Normandy, but within weeks in Normandy, all of them had been killed. All my other friends as well, some tank commanders I knew, the lot had gone, literally. And you feel a little bit isolated. You're never going to make friends as you did in the desert. The situation was different.
Well, let's go back then to that. What was your job on the tank?
I was the wireless operator and the loader. And my best bit of work was when these Crusader tanks came up to replace our Grants, and we got them serviceable on these transporters and went down towards Ajdabiya and Aguila. We got them. We knew all about them by then. We'd never seen them before, except the drivers, and we were stopping troops, Germans escaping, and one day we refilled 3 times, and we were firing continuously. And I remember in the end coming to soaked with water on the floor of the turret. The fumes overcame me. The nasty headache for days. But that was pretty intensive, and I think it was said that Henry was recommended for a second MM for that. You popped up along, you didn't fire from one spot, you popped along to a few hundred yards away, and it looked as if there were more of us than there were. There was only a composite squadron of first tanks and fifth tanks.
Did you call that jockeying? We used to call that jockeying, where you fire, come back on the ridge, and come back somewhere else.
Well, we didn't have fancy names for it.
Let's go back to those characters then, because you've mentioned Henry Hall or Emin Hall. How would you describe him as a person? What did he look like? How did he talk?
A very solid chap, chunky. Well, still preserved his black tank tops, and was confident with everybody. And when he had a new troop commander, he was bow gunner. Nobody was going to... A chap coming straight from England and becoming troop leader was a nonsense, utter nonsense. And we all know if there was a damn good chance of being killed, that's the best way to do it. So people used to take valve out of their radios and say, I'm sorry, my radio's not working. You know, he was trying to swap tanks. And so Henry ran 11 Troop. It was Henry's troop, it was recognised. An enormous pair of German binoculars, great magnification. And he was always called upon, even by the CO, Henry, can you have a look at that cloud of dust? So he had a great reputation in the regiment.
How old was he? Because presumably you were a young man.
He was old enough to be my father. I did meet him after the war.
You talk about his natural authority in the troop. Presumably that derived from competence,
yes.
Above all else.
Yes. And character. He was a very affable character. And when I went on his crew, he put me through the hoop. I learnt to drive tanks up ramps onto Scammell lorries where you were still driving up and all you could see was the sky and a couple of hands and through the sand and all that sort of thing. He's a great guy.
Was there any, I mean, one of the things I've spoken to a few people about is how the NCOs gained and retained their authority. And it seems to me that in the peacetime army that maybe had more to do with fists and shouting and all the rest of it. Or, well, do you think there was some of that, or?
You could probably count the number of people put on a charge in one hand. I mean, it wasn't necessary. And I mean, the demonstration of how the mutual trust existed in the 5th Tanks, and it's exemplarily done by Fearless Jim in his forwards to Jake Wardrop's book. He thought the sergeants were marvellous. And when we pulled out in Northwest Europe and had parties, we required Arthur, the squadron leader, to sing. Now, that wouldn't happen in most regiments, certainly not the cavalry. And but it was mutual trust. We wouldn't overstep the mark with Arthur. He knew he'd got to sing anyway. And that's the way it went. There was discipline wasn't something which was had to be displayed.
You alluded to the way that Henry Hall managed new officers, and that was in the midst of some other things you were explaining. So I wonder if we could just look at that issue on its own.
Yeah.
You mentioned he ran 11 Troop.
Yeah.
In what sense were keen new officers a danger to the rest of you?
Well, they had no experience of how we went about things, and things changed even in the desert. The last tank-to-tank battle in the desert was at Sidi Rezai, when tanks converged on each other, led by O'Connor's in his Humber Scout car on one occasion, and they battled it out. And that was feasible before the long-barreled 50mm guns went on the Mark IVs. But the Germans adopted a different tactic. They knew we would always come at them. So what they did when we were trying to push forward, they put anti-tank guns in front of the tanks. We would go forward and they got us before we... So there were no more tank-to-tank battles after that. You had to adopt a different approach entirely. And of course we were outgunned most of the time.
You're saying that really after the anti-tank guns became more important, it's much more of an all-arms battle, presumably, with the artillery and infantry suppressing the ATs. Yeah.
With the exceptions, of course, on the two occasions when Montgomery used, as Lewis said in his book, as infantry was used in World War I. At Alamein, the three armoured divisions, the Corps de Chasse, he called it, were going to break through. And he told General Lumsden, who said, if we do that, I should get 50% casualties. I can't suffer that. No, that is beyond my remit to do that. And Montgomery said, you might end up with a third only, but you will do it. And they lost 500 tanks. And there's 150 tanks in a division. That's why we had to come up from the south and in our old Grants and flog away. And he did it again at Goodwood in Normandy. I mean, why Goodwood? Fancy calling a tank attack Goodwood as if you were going to the races. And again, they lost 400 on the first day. Well, it was said 400, but they lost a lot. But the others, most of the people who fought in Normandy had been in Europe. Not many experienced divisions, but Montgomery took us and the 7th Armoured and the 51st Highland Division and the 50th Tyres and Tees Division wherever he went. We came in for most of the sticky stuff. But at Goodwood, if we could take advantage of the ground, we did. We certainly didn't charge in and lose our tanks, because in the desert, if you did that, you'd lost the ground, you'd lost the battle. That's common sense. But no, Montgomery insisted that no matter what the losses, you go in.
Just, Bob, if I can take you back to the to old Emin Hall and his troop officers, people like Lieutenant Boone.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me why. Well, you mentioned before when you were talking that you would take your valve out of the radio set. Now, I know what you're talking about, but if you could just explain a bit about the whole issue of young officers and why someone like Emin Hall was not prepared to do what the manual in theory said he ought to, which is to be their second in command as troop commander.
Well, these, as Fearless Jim says, the sergeants were the experienced people. So any new officer had to lean on and listen to the troop sergeant if he was going to get anywhere. And nobody wanted to be in his tank if he was going off on his own and doing something silly. So if the troop officer's wireless set broke down, he would jump on somebody else's tank in the troop and take over. And Skeels, Jake Warbrook's great friend, he was a wireless operator, and he did this business of taking the wireless the valve out, just to counter that. Nobody in their right mind wanted to be in a new troop leader's tank. They just hadn't got the experience, and experience kept you kept you going and won the day, really. You couldn't afford to go around losing tanks all the time. So it was an unenviable job to be a troop sergeant, a troop leader. And of course we lost many of them, and frankly, Lieutenant Boone has made a name for himself, but because of Henry. But amongst my recollections of people, doesn't include troop officers.
You, I think, mentioned to me that when you went into action on one occasion, the officer was on the floor of the turret. He wasn't able to face the music in that sense.
The selection of officers was clearly not working properly. We picked up this tank which I called the Pepper Pot, and we were in C Squadron, but B Squadron wanted a reinforcement, and we transferred temporarily to B Squadron. And on the breakthrough from Alamein, there was a small anti-tank gun. I didn't see it. I couldn't see it. And he was grovelling on the floor of the tank. And Bill was a gunner. And Bill did the necessary firing, and nothing. We didn't come unstuck. But this was we were green crew, really. We'd have been through the minefield, but this was our first action, if you like. And Bill that night went round to see the troop sergeant and told him what he thought of this chap, and he went.
And that's how it was done.
Yeah. A
quiet word in the Liga at night.
Well,
and
yeah.
off he'd go.
And of course, some people couldn't take some people lasted longer without getting, what's it called, post-traumatic
stress.
Well, you all got it, really. And but some lasted longer than others. And some of these chaps, it's understandable, but being put slap bang in front of in a troop and be expected to do something that they didn't comprehend really, because none of the training in Britain was relevant. You didn't fire on the move. That was a daft thing to do. You didn't use Morse. I tried it once and it didn't work. If you fired on the move, you gave your position away. The last thing you wanted to do, because the sights on the German guns, the new 50 millimeters and the 88s, were such that they could count the rivets on the front of our tanks. So never fire unless you got a meaningful shot in.
Were you brewed up in the desert?
I was extremely lucky. We were hit, but never brewed up. And once we reversed an 88. We were in the valley on reverse slope, about to cross the Seine, and an 88 with a Neverworth with it got a bead on the crossroads, and it hit the tank which went to that crossroad. It was Benny, my first driver. And then it traversed left, and there were we. We were in the middle of the field, a few trees and things, and it fired at us. And we had to reverse all the way several hundred yards up this bank. And it was firing all the time. You could see the clods of earth coming up. That was near.
Sounds like a pretty grim experience.
Well, I hit.
So in the desert, you fortunately did not...
A miss was as good as a mile. And you had to believe that, because you wouldn't have been able to continue if you didn't.
One of the troop leaders, Lieutenant Stone, who was wounded and captured, he wrote quite a good little memoir of the desert. And he talks about the anti-tank rounds coming in with a pressure wave that caused like a whipping up a tail of sand
Yeah.
behind the rounds as they came across the line of tanks advancing.
Yeah.
Did you ever see anything like that? What was the sensation of being
I
under
remember
fire?
we had Joe, the sergeant, tank commander. He was one of the few chaps there who was not nice. He was a rotten devil. And he was deaf, and he chain smoked as a consequence, and he didn't want to admit he was deaf. And there was this whoosh, and we knew exactly what it was. An 88. It was a marathon. Joe. He told us where to go, and but he realised afterwards that he was a liability, and he did go. He directed me to a trench. I wanted to get out for obvious purposes, and he directed me to a trench. And when I got there, there was all the ricochets imaginable, and he'd been sitting there happy as Larry. I quickly found another spot.
Let's talk a little bit about the working conditions in the desert, in the sense of the tanks themselves, and then we'll maybe talk a bit about the climate and other things like that. But you mentioned to me the Grant was it's a big beast, isn't it?
It's a big beast, and because the 75mm gun was in a sponson at the side, when you got the best position to be in was hull down cover, just expose your gun. Because the gun was in a sponson, the whole turret and the top of the tank was exposed. Now that was not nice, but you couldn't fire the darn thing unless you could clear the top of the ridge.
And it had multiple engines, didn't it? It was
they came in various varieties. And so did the Sherman, for that matter. And the one I remember most was the air-cooled engine, because when I went with Henry Hall to cut off the Germans at Tripoli, I was in khaki, KD, and all I got was my small kit. It was done in the rush, and all the others got khaki. And in the morning you had stand to, and the engine started up, and there's this great fan about that wide, and it sucked the air to cool the engine. Oh, freezing, absolutely freezing. Then they introduced in the Sherman and in the Grant, I believe, 5 Chrysler engines, so you had 5 clutches. And then they produced the 2-stroke diesels. Now these were something. The 2-stroke diesels were a pair, and they were extremely good, but you must never dab your foot when you turn off, because the diesel would drip down on the cylinder and you have a hole in the cylinder. But they were very good. And we're in troops of 3 or 4, and so sometimes there were 15 tanks in a squadron of 4 troops, and sometimes there were 4. In Europe, it was always 3. And at night, you pulled back, whatever contact you made, you pulled back into a lager. The lager is the South African word. And HQ went across the top, C Squadron on the right, A Squadron on the left, and all the soft skins went in the middle. And you had the guns firing outwards. And the rifle brigade, our motorised infantry, used to have patrols around the outside. And they used to be, everybody was told the password, because you were all on watch. And if you bumped into any of the rifle brigade, they never knew that it was you. Passwords didn't mean anything to them. A great happy-go-lucky bunch of cockneys. And I must tell you about their CO. Their CO was a huddled old man. He was hunchbacked. He was as scruffy as hell, and he'd got a hair lip. and they thought the world of him. And but between themselves, they called him Nuff Nuff. But anybody else called him Nuff Nuff, and they were. And he was a terrific chap. But I don't know whether Montgomery met him here. Incidentally, the interesting thing is that at Alamein, everybody was supposed to do PT and all this sort of thing. We were way down the south. And Montgomery visited us, and I think he came to the conclusion that if you can't beat them, join them. So he put a tank badge on his. He didn't know anything about tanks. He never had control of his tanks in his life. But he wore that right to the end. And I'm sure that was the logic behind it. Because we were still as scruffy as we were when we were in the desert.
Can I ask you about Colonel Hutton?
Yeah.
Your impressions of him?
Yes.
And also, being a wireless op, the system that he operated with the whole regiment on one net.
That's right.
And how all that worked.
Right. Well, the pepper pot I first went in had 2 radios, and consequently you had 2 headsets. Well, how the hell I was supposed to listen to the tank commander and the messages I mean, that was utter bloody nonsense. And we got the 19 sets, which were quite good. They had a shortwave set incorporated, which would enable you to talk to the troop on a separate wavelength. But we got away from that entirely. Jim arranged for us all to be on the same net. So everybody in the regiment was on the same net.
How many
50 tanks plus the horse artillery and so on. And that meant a bit of different discipline. And when things hotted up, there were quite a number of people in trouble and wanted to get on, but they had to operate this discipline. And when it got really hotted up, Jim used to come along, witherum, wetherum, ditherum, dim, wine, merry winkle, terror diddle dim. It was something like that. I used to adopt it for netting in when he left. And people all netted in and discipline was re-established. That was one of his features. But we all had great faith in him. He knew what he was doing. He never shouted. He always asked for advice on what was happening there and said, well, we knew he got his finger on the button and then we knew what he was doing, and it was apparent he knew what he was doing. And he had great respect for us and we had great respect for him. But he disagreed with Brigadier Brushwood, as we called him, and he had to go. And when he went, he was in tears. And we all lined up to see him go.
And that was over a stupid disagreement about training.
I don't know
the brigadier.
I don't know what it was about, but
he was unceremoniously sacked, despite everything he'd done.
Yeah. Well, that's the way of the army. And we got Screaming Willie instead.
You mentioned how the tanks were almost like boats bobbing about on the sea in the desert, and you didn't see much of other people in the squadron. And
yeah.
But this thing of all netting in on one net was a way that suddenly the CO, good or bad, became a presence for all of you, didn't he?
Yeah.
That leadership,
yes,
at that point became a factor.
Yes, but the good CO left the squadron leader to get on with his whatever he was doing at the time, and only intervened when the squadron leader or somebody thought there might be a new tactic to employ. So he wasn't on the air all the time. He was on when it was needed.
Well, it would be unworkable, wouldn't it, if everybody was constantly...
Yeah, he was Sunray. And each squadron netted separately. So I was often squadron operator, and I netted the squadron in. On one occasion, 12 able was missing. This was in Europe, and I had to try and find where 12 able was. And I got him eventually. It was Horchowski, a German Jewish chap who joined us. And I asked him to report his signals. He said strength 5. I said, what's the situation? He said, there are Victor 12 able, Victor 12 able. There are very many vehicles and we are unable to move. And I was splitting my sides and I thought, we've got to have that again. I said, sorry, strength 3, would you repeat? No, I didn't repeat it for everybody.
Tell me about one or two other characters I wanted to ask you about. You've told us about the Colonel and about Emin Hall. Wardrop.
Wardrop's had cat's eyes. Now, nobody's mentioned that, but he had slits. And he was a great character. He was frequently Paddy Doyle, the squadron leader's driver. And Paddy Doyle himself says that he was a marvellous driver and he was promoted many times, and I demoted him as many times because whenever they went out drinking with Skeels and Simpson, there was a fight. And so Wardrop was up and down the ranks regularly. But eventually he went to... I forget which troop it was, and became a tank commander, and seemed to keep out of trouble. I think I still had their fights. So yeah, he was a very unique character, and somebody must have strapped up his guitar in the roof of a cab, and every now and again, when Arthur was singing his song, he used to bring his guitar out and play it. And he was one of the notable characters of the regulars who were still left. Because it was a regular battalion.
Earlier when we were talking, you referred to Wardrop's cronies, which was an interesting expression. What was it about him that held other men in awe of him?
Well, if...
He was physically quite imposing.
Oh, they're all boxers.
Because of the boxing.
They're all boxers. And Skeels, his friend, the smell of a barman's apron, and Skeels had to hit somebody. Oh, he was a terror. And Bill and I picked him up one night and put him in his tent. But they were this drinking community, and you either drank or you didn't. And so... really didn't get involved with them. And anyway, they were in another troop. The troops didn't get together too often, but we came together when we had our squadron parties. His
diary is pretty remarkable, isn't it? Because he comes across as a very intelligent man.
Yeah, he was.
A very angry man, but in some way neither formally educated nor with an outlet for his emotions and his anger. I suppose that produced the drinking and the fights and the...
Yeah.
You mentioned before you're surprised that he said in the diary that he wanted to go to Burma at the end of the war.
Totally illogical. He and Simpson both did it. They were great friends. That seems utterly crazy that anyone should want to do that. We'd been going, the 5th Tanks had been in France. They went to the desert, and we were on the go all the way to the end of the war. Whereas most of the troops who were in Northwest Europe had been in they were only in the war from June to the following May. So for we having the people who've been in the regiment for a long time, to want to continue doing that, it's just plain. I can't comprehend it. I can't think why they should want to do that. Why should people want to fight all the time?
Roy Dixon, I think, was the adjutant when Wardrop was killed, and he says that he can remember it had quite an effect in the regiment.
Oh, it did.
Do you think by that point he was almost representative of the old regular army NCOs in the battalion, who presumably by that point were quite small in number?
Oh, yeah. I was with Arthur at the time. I was the squadron operator, and I've read Arthur's account of the war for his families, sanitised version, which most people who were sane did, I suppose. I did the same. And he puts in captions, besides to take Wardrop, they had no counselling. And I think he's referring to the relatives. And it was in April, just before the war ended. And there were two of them. There was, in addition to Jake, there was Snowy Harris. Both of them long-term, long-serving regulars. And they'd obviously got crews with them who were also long-serving. They're people they knew. And they'd just gone up side roads to check on, there was nothing up there which would bust up a centre line. And they got ambushed by Panzerfaust. Mad Jack got out, but that's another story altogether. So there were 9 of them within a month of the end of the war, or 3 weeks of the end of the war, all killed. Now there are 15 tanks, that's 75 people in the squadron, and 9 of them who'd been in the desert went. That shook us all up. And there was a sequel to that. I don't think I'll tell you about that because that's part of the story I'm doing with Marianne. But there was a sequence to that which would have involved Arthur and myself. Okay. And at the end of the war, one night, we were drinking some of the beer from our brewery north of the Kiel Canal. And I didn't drink much, but I went there for company. And somebody said, well, how many people were at Alamein? And we counted up, and there were 27, which includes the echelon. Now, half the squadron was tank crew, 75. The other half were fitters, storemen, lorry drivers, bringing up supplies, all that sort of thing. So most of the casualties, of course, were in the tank crews. So there were 75 tank crews, and we reckoned a maximum of 10 were at Alamein at the end of the war. And I couldn't comprehend that. Where did they all go? And another startling statistic is that the chap who wrote the book,
Edward
Wilson reckoned that 2,000 to 2,500 people passed through the regiment during the war. Well, the basic establishment was about 460, might be as much as 500 if you had 4 tanks in a squadron. And the concept of that many going through the battalion is hard to conceive when you know how many were killed in Northwest Europe and so on. And I think an awful lot of people didn't come up to scratch. Well, they cracked too quickly, and they just went. They weren't shot, they just went. And I think an awful lot of that must have gone on.
I think we should probably round off for this first session, Bob, but I just want to ask you, before we leave the desert, as it were, one or two final thoughts. Some people characterise the Desert War as more chivalrous or gentlemanly than Northwest Europe. What did you think of the Africa Corps and the Germans when you laid eyes on them? How did you regard them?
Initially, if you burnt out of a tank, they didn't fire at you. After Alamein, they shot everybody. But if you were taken prisoner, we treated them civilly, and we stuck to the rules. There were no atrocities. It wasn't until you got the SS and the Waffen-SS and the cadets and the Hitler Youth involved that things got really nasty.
You mentioned the...
it was a clean war as well. The desert was pretty clean.
Well, very few civilians, I suppose, around. And
a few camels now and again. And the Bedouin were the most civilised people in Libya.
Tell me just about the point you started with there, which is the sort of almost unwritten rule that if you bailed out, because talking to the three gentlemen who were in Northwest Europe, they said it was absolutely clear that you would machine gun enemy crew as they bailed out, and that was the name of the game. So
that's right.
Was there a period when you were in the desert where that didn't apply? Just tell me a little bit about that sort of understanding of tank man to tank man.
Well, most of this situation arose when there were tank-to-tank battles, because you were in amongst each other. But after the Gazala line, when he produced his anti-tank guns, different tactics, the tank battles were at a longer range. So, no, the rules still applied, but it wasn't as significant because the range was different.
This chap, Brian Stone, he lost one of his legs and he bailed out, and he describes in his book the lengths the Germans went to rescue him. But you're saying after Alamein, something changed.
Well, we're fine. I wouldn't say the chivalry went. I mean, dear old our padre used to go and drive out and pick up the injured, no matter what, and survived. So yes, they let him do that.
Did you have a feeling? I mean, maybe just describe the end of the desert for you. Presumably, you got to Tunis. What was the atmosphere like, and did you, in a sense, feel you'd won the war?
Oh, it was marvellous going to Tunis because we were the first tanks to go through. They're all silent. Who the hell are they? It's complete silence. And I got out, it's called parler anglais, no? And I said, nous sommes anglais. We t'aime armée. And I said, Jabot. And they went bloody mad. It was amazing. And before long, the whole floor of the turret was filled with bottles of wine, Lauenbrau beer, Munich. In the Jewish section, a chap was shaving and stopped his shaving. Oh, that was marvellous. But of course, and then we cleared up, and I captured a squadron of Spahi on my own. had to run back and get the tank because the officers started arguing when they wanted their pistols. And I got the tank, got them on the road, and I captured a fort of the base fort. Knocked on the door, and the German came to the door, Rouse on the road, and they all came piling. I wasn't going in on my own, and they all came piling out, going on the road and off, and I've got the keys. And then, of course, shortly after that, we were sent back to Homs. Now, the biggest, all the gen had been, we go to Casablanca, Cairo, or home. And we went to Homs, 70 miles from Tripoli, on the beach. And we were back to bully and biscuits, not American K rations again. And the letdown, and there's a song about it, which we sing. And there was the Arby's rioted, and Granny Horrocks, General Horrocks, was appointed our div commander, or was he corps commander? Corps commander. And he came down to see us. And we all gathered around him, and thereafter he was known as Granny Horrocks. He knew exactly what we felt like. He knew why we felt like it, and but he would do his best for us. Marvellous bloke. Did a resume of the war on TV shortly after the war. One of the most brilliant resumes of the war that there was.
Can you just explain why people? I mean, you've hinted that you were expecting to go somewhere else. Was it purely about the living conditions and the food, or was it that you felt in a way that your war should end at that point?
Well, we never left the desert. We were supposed to be re-equipped, but we used to go back to the 1st Armoured Division and pinch some regiment's tanks and go back again. They didn't replace us, we took their tanks. So we were always there. And, you know, it's somebody else's turn sort of thing. And to be stuck in the desert, and we were smothered, most of us were smothered in desert sauce. I got one that lasted 18 months. We weren't fit for purpose. The MO came, stated this. So they brought out dried cabbage, which we called boiled gas cape. I mean, you eat bloody stuff. Oh, God, it was horrible. That didn't do any good. They brought out sulfanilamide. It looked as if it would work, but the skin healed over the sores and they broke out again. And they brought in this penicillin. And we were all on penicillin for quite a long while. And we all had dippo tummy because you had a bit of melon and all the flies were fighting for it at the other end. And there's only so many flies. Every time you went anywhere near an Arab community, even if it was only a farm, the flies were there. The hygiene was shocking.
Thank you. Graham, is there anything on this first part of the...
No, I think it's all very well covered.
We've obviously talked over quite... I mean, for someone who's never been in a tank battle, which clearly is the vast majority of people, what were the sights and sensations like of being in action in one of these Grants or Shermans?
Well, in the 7th Armoured Division, you always had your head out of the turret. Apparently, some of these regiments who came to France used to look through the turret periscopes. That was useless. You've got to have your head out of the turret. If an anti-tank gun fired from over there or over there, you've got to be able to see it right away, first time. There might not be a second time. And so the tank commander always had his head out of the turret. And he was the only man who could really see everything. The driver had a hole that size, and we had periscopes, so they were pretty useless. you couldn't see much from there. So he knew what was going on. We knew what was going on through the radio because everybody in the tank had radio, and you had to rely on your tank commander. So he didn't let your imagination play around too much.
In terms of imagining what might be happening. Was it very frightening being in those?
Well, everybody was scared. I mean, everybody said they'd be liars if they didn't.
Thanks, Bob. Let's pause for have a break.
Right, good. Old nose to tail because the war was nearly over. And I had this noise, I couldn't make out what it was. So I stood on the turret, looked over the edge, and there was a jet fighter taking off. And I thought, my God. And this jet fighter went shooting up in the air, turned round, and I let out a yell. It was obvious what he was going to do. And he came straight down the line and firing all the time. And we all took cover. And I heard a bang and a couple of lorries went up. And when we got out, our food locker, a cannon shell had gone straight through our food locker. Jam, bully, the lot, all mangled up. And I remember saying, "Oh, that was a rotten so-and-so." And Arthur was laughing his head off.
Let's just finish off. Well, not North Africa because we've done that, but maybe Italy. And then we'll get to the whole Shaker's Wood thing. Tell me just a little bit about the Sherman. Because I think in order to understand the Cromwell saga, one needs to understand a little bit about the Sherman and to what extent did the crews like that and was it a comfortable tank to fight from?
The Sherman was the best we'd had so far. And he'd got a reasonably adequate 76mm gun on it. There was more room on it and it was reliable. So, yes, we were happy with the Sherman, but we were quite aware that we got them in North Africa, and we were quite aware that Rommel had acquired Panthers and Tigers. We first met the Tigers at Marath, and of course they had far superior guns to ours, and we were in a position where we had to get within about a couple of 100 yards and shoot between the tracks to knock them out. So it was a different ball game. HE, we fired HE, and you could at least brass up the people inside, and they wouldn't be so eager to come forward. But we hadn't got the AP knockout power that we never did have. We never did have.
When you mentioned the Tigers at Marath, did you personally see them there, or was it something that came through the grapevine?
No, I didn't see them because our role at Marath, having fought there to get there, was to sit behind the infantry on the narrow gap there was, which was heavily fortified with French fortifications. We were there to back up the infantry who were having a hard time. And unbeknown to the Germans, the New Zealanders were going round the back. And we got heavily stonked by Nebelwerfers, and 88s were being fired, but at extreme range. So we didn't see them. We were sitting there most of the day just taking punishment. Tank next door was a diesel tank. We thought they wouldn't go up so easily. But when a mortar bomb hit the back of it, it compresses the diesel and woof, it goes up like a petrol tank.
Yes, I mean the Shermans were called Ronsons at one point, weren't they?
Yeah. or Tommy cookers.
Tell me about the Salerno landing then, because you went from Libya there
Yeah,
back into action in southern Italy.
yes, we were attached to. There was a corps attached to Mark Clark's Ninth Army,
Fifth
I think.
Army, I think.
Fifth or Ninth, I never remember which. And we landed on the. They were hard pushed. It was the landing was anticipated. It was a. There was nothing secret about it, how it leaked out of His Holiness. And so there was a battle all the way in. And there are two beaches, an American beach and an English beach. And the English beach held its ground, and the Americans were pushed back to within 3 miles of the beach, and Mark Clark made representations to be able to move his beachhead onto our beachhead. And Montgomery and Wavell were having none of it. Well, it was impractical. But it left our bridgehead exposed on a flank which we didn't expect to be exposed. And they needed 1,500 infantry replacements. And there lies the long trail then of the so-called Salerno mutiny, where the reinforcements should have come from the First Army. The First Army sent a request to the Eighth Army, and people came who should never have, who according to Eighth Army rules, should be go back to their own units. And the sergeant simply pointed that out, but they were held to be mutinous and were sent to the First Army First Army depot. Generals came out from Britain, condemned the sergeants to death, 10 years hard labour for the corporals and 5 years hard labour for the rest. And these are chaps who'd fought all the way up from through the desert and were merely complying with Eighth Army rules. A 2IC the deputy, the CIGS, went to North Africa, heard about these sentences, asked for the papers, and the sentences were squashed, but not entirely. If they were on one slight charge, they would be, the original sentences would be reinstated. They had to go to units in the Fifth Army, the Italian units, not their own units, and were treated as rebels. Some of them committed suicide. It was a very sad thing.
You, what was it like, I suppose, in terms of a difference of feel being in southern Italy compared with North Africa? I mean, obviously much greener and...
There were orchards or tomato fields, and you couldn't see any distance ahead. So it's largely a question of recce and moving up inch by inch up the road. And Arthur Crickmay was in charge of recce at that stage. And I've asked Isabel to get his citation, but I haven't seen it yet. But I'm sure it's for the recce at Spalanese.
I've got a copy of it actually somewhere.
You have?
Yes, I have. I can copy it for you if you want.
Oh, could you?
Yes.
Yeah, because we must have that to validate what I'm saying.
In a way, it was lousy country for tanks, wasn't it?
Oh yes, yes.
I mean, you were very vulnerable.
Yes.
But you couldn't see very far.
You couldn't see very far. Getting off the roads was very difficult. Going through orchards, the only benefit sometimes was the lemons and oranges dropped in the tank, but you could bog down very easily, as we did outside Spalanese. the brigadier helped us put brushwood underneath to get out. And on the BBC, on the night that we took Piranesi, I switched over to the second channel, which wasn't the official channel, it was the BBC. And I learned that the Americans of the Fifth Army had just taken Piranesi. There wasn't an American in sight.
During that phase, I mean, I think it was only 3 months.
It wasn't very long.
You also got to know Dicker Wilson, your commanding officer.
Yeah.
I mean, that was when I suppose he first went into action with the regiment. What were your impressions of him?
I think it was best left with my expression. I called him Screaming Willie. I think to say any more might be, it wouldn't be complimentary.
The contrast, though, between him and Havassman in the way they used the radio, or the way their personality was communicated, because you had this regimental radio net.
Yes.
Was an important part, in a way, wasn't it, of people taking against him?
Yeah. Yes. It works well when you're all sort of in a line, roughly, and everybody knows what's going on. But if you're some way behind, especially in country like Italy, you haven't a clue what's going on.
I mean, obviously, as a detached observer, I want to be as fair as possible, including to Wilson. And one thing that occurs to me is that, given the circumstances of Colonel Hutton's departure, it would have been quite hard for anybody to have had an easy start in the regiment. Do you think that's fair? Do you think people...
I think having been all the way up to the desert and taking Tunis, anybody taking over from Hutton was on got a difficult job to live up to him.
One more thing I'm interested in Italy. I mean, it's not a very big part of the story, but the regiment was clearly thinking about fighting in Northern Europe as well. I think that was already on the cards. They were thinking about the differences between North Africa and Italy and the north of Europe. How far...
we weren't thinking about D-Day at that stage.
Well, strangely enough, I've discovered a letter from Dicker Wilson from Italy to another CO of 6 RTR in which he is looking forward to D-Day and Northern Europe. But I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is, if you're not in the desert and you're in this very close country, some of the techniques that were used, for example, the tank commanders going ahead on foot.
Yes.
Which presumably was not something you needed to do in the desert, or was very dangerous to do in the desert, or...
Well, you could get out and have a look at the top of a dune away from the tank, but yeah, there wasn't a lot of call for it in the desert. It was an entirely different environment, completely different. It must be said there, of course, that Montgomery was clearly taking ourselves, the 50th Division and 51st Highland Division, with him. And so whatever Montgomery did, we were involved in.
Tell me about the homecoming after Italy.
It was supposed to be secret. So we loaded up but we knew we were going home. And so we loaded out our kit bag with everything we could buy, silk stockings and all that sort of thing. And any cracks and crannies were filled up with nuts. So our kit bags weighed a ton. In the event, we had to march to the quayside in the middle of the night. It had to be secret, you see. And we were carrying it. Several of these things went in the water. We stopped at Oran and... we're expecting to be home for Christmas, but it was said that the Americans took our convoy because they needed training. Well, how much training would they do at Christmas? And anyway, we eventually got to Glasgow in January, and it was pouring with rain, and we were put on trains, and I think it took a couple of days to get down to Setford. And nobody would tell us where we were. We hadn't a clue where we were. We were just in these woods, and it was raining, it was wet, and these Nissen huts were pretty cold. It wasn't very welcoming.
Just give me some idea, Bob, when the last time was that you'd seen your parents or siblings, your family, and what the circumstances were of being reunited with them.
I left in Christmas 41, and it was now January 44. I managed to get to King's Cross in the middle of the night, and I walked all the way home to Southgate in North London because there was no other way of getting home. Yeah, it was marvellous.
What time of day was it when you arrived, and were they expecting
About 2 o'clock in the morning. Woke them all up.
Were they expecting you or not?
Yes, they were expecting me. I managed to make a phone call, but I didn't. You could never tell what time you would arrive on a train in those days. You were so frequently shoved into sidings and left there.
And what was the atmosphere like at home? Presumably there was a lot of catching up. Did you tell them much about your experiences in the desert, or did you prefer not to open up about that?
I don't think anybody in their right mind told their families about the traumatic things, and that goes for today as well. So you merely, it was a chit chat and not the gory details.
And I suppose they didn't want to pry; they were just happy to have you there.
Mm.
How long did the leave last? And then tell me about going back to regimental life after your leave.
Depending on the length of you've been away, so your leave was determined. I think I got 3 weeks. But a lot of the regulars had been away for a very long time, so they had Python leave, 4 weeks. And I got back to the camp, and people were gradually trickling back. The regulars weren't back yet. And there was this tank under a tarpaulin, and we were to be shown this tank. And they pulled the tarpaulin off, and my immediate remark was, what the hell is that? Because the armour was flat. No attempt at convex armour, which gives you twice the protection. The front of the turret was flat, and the gun seemed to be a grown-up 2-pounder. A marvellous engine in it. You could do 55 in a Cromwell, but what good was it against Panthers and Tigers, which we'd already met, or Mark IVs with 50mm long barrel guns? It was out guns and out armoured right from the start. And if after the war, I went to the Tank Museum and I couldn't find it, I hide it. And I eventually found it. And in their blurb about the museum, they described it as a reconnaissance tank. And I took umbrage at this. I said, how is it? I wrote to the 7th Armoured Division, Max Hastings, various other people. How on earth can you describe it as a reconnaissance tank when we did a head-on assault at Goodwood? And Max Hastings agreed entirely. And then I discovered that the librarian of the Tank Museum had produced a book, The Great Tank Scandal. And it exposes the total inadequacy of British tank construction. Whilst during the war the Germans could produce a new model almost very quickly, and the Russians moved a factory from the east to the Urals and built the T-34. But we couldn't produce anything like that.
Were you involved in the so-called morale-boosting visit to the Cromwell factory that didn't go quite as people had hoped?
No, I wasn't. It was perhaps as well I didn't.
Well, I think the story was that the guys from the regiment went up there and told them in no uncertain terms what they thought of it, which was not quite what the information ministry had been hoping for. Tell me...
We did have one Firefly, which was a Sherman with a 17-pounder on it. Just before D-Day, we got one per troop, which was at least something which would have a go at a Panther or a Mark IV.
Tell me then about the circumstances that led to this confrontation between Emin Hall and the CO there in Shakers Wood, because you've talked about a couple of the issues, but how did you see the whole thing build up?
There was a lack of trust and confidence between ourselves and the CO. And he didn't do anything to improve the situation. In fact, quite the opposite. He requires us to take the royal oath again every time we left the camp. And for chaps who fought all the way from Halloween, that's not on, and Henry Hall said so. And this led to the confrontation.
He'd been put in jail though, hadn't he?
Yes, he was waiting court-martial. But there are friends of the 5th RTR who heard about it and made representations. And in the end, it was Willie who went.
He was sacked.
Yeah.
Because he'd lost the confidence of
That's right. But unfortunately, Henry Hall had to go to another unit, which I think is absolutely tragic. Great man like that.
What role do you think Jackie Garnett played in that? Because some people... I
never knew Jackie Garnett, so I'm not qualified to say anything at all about Jackie Garnett. I didn't know him.
Some people say that he energised the former commanding officer Dinham Drew once he knew Emin Hall was in jail.
Well, I can well imagine. It was those sort of channels that resolved the situation.
Okay, just backtrack one little bit, Bob. I mean, in terms of this point about the oath of allegiance, I suppose if he were here today, Colonel Wilson, he would say that a lot of men had been going AWOL or going to the pub and various other things in contravention of orders. I mean, was there a sense in which the regiment was just not being treated like grown-ups, or that the orders that were being issued about not leaving camp?
If the right people had spoken to us, for instance, Granny Horrocks, matters could have been sorted, but there's no attempt to do anything like that.
But many people, as I understand it, many people wanted to get home for leave, and it was stalled. So some people went AWOL. Is that right? Or
I didn't know that any leave had been stalled. But yes, some people... Well, some of these married men have been away for a year. I don't blame him one bit. After all, if you'd been in England, you would have had a leave every month, I think it was. And here we were, we weren't even getting that. There's a bit of disparity.
do you think, I mean, you yourself have mentioned the part of the foreword where Jim Hutton talks about the sergeants and how important they were to the running of the regiment. did the Wilson episode effectively show that if you lost the confidence of the long-serving NCO tank commanders,
Yes.
you were finished?
Yes. Yes.
Is it fair to? Was it in a sense a mutiny?
It wasn't mutiny exactly. It was a lack of respect for a CO.
And just finally, just to round off that episode, just let's pick up on what happened to Emin Hall himself. Was he able simply to step back into 11 Troop and take over where he left off before he was put in jail?
Oh no, he was put in immediately. He made his complaint. He was under court martial discipline.
And what happened to him?
He was under guard until released as a consequence of these representations.
And when the whole drama was over, what became of Emin Hall?
He went to the
Staffordshire Yeomanry.
Staffordshire Yeomanry, yeah.
Yeah. So
that was the price he had to pay for his challenging the CO's authority.
But you still regard him as a hero for that, don't
Absolutely.
you?
Oh, absolutely. He had the interests of the First Tanks at heart when he did that. He wasn't complaining on a personal basis. This was the spokesman of the Fifth Tanks talking.
Just one other thing I wanted to ask you about the homecoming. Obviously, there had been quite a lot of mentions of the Desert Rats and the division in the newspapers at home, in the newsreels. People knew about it, and in a way, because of Alamein and Tunis and everything else, it was a sort of famous formation, wasn't it? Mm. When people saw your badge and presumably you were very tanned, and when you came back to England, was that a subject of conversation that you were part of the Desert Rats? How did people respond to you?
Well, first of all, they weren't supposed to know we were home, and there was no publicity given to it. Well, I used to avoid it, so I suppose if you went into a pub, you might. But I didn't go into pubs. So, amongst my friends, yes, but I avoided that sort of situation.
Roy Dixon has described to us arriving at Shaker's Wood and being the only man without the Africa Star, as he put it.
Well,
he also said you spoke a mixture of Arabic and English that was completely baffling.
Well, I think Dennis Hewitt puts it quite well. We got a lot of the regulars left us, a third, according to Arthur. He was, after all, he was adjutant, and Arthur could sort all these problems out about Willie if he only put it down in writing somewhere. Perhaps he did, but Leakey's cut it out. Or Leakey's cut the Boardrop's account out. But Arthur knew all about it and doesn't mention it at all in his account of the war. So people coming in and joining us, yeah, we all got the Africa Star. And they all came from, a lot of them came from Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, where they'd been Blanco in the coal and all that sort of thing. No, I thought it was a great release. They were very pleased to be with us. And they said that they they were a bit in awe of the rest of us for a time, but they found that we were friendly enough, really.
I was going to ask, but picking up on that thought, I mean the Africa Star, the language peppered with all these strange
Julibro.
Arabic words.
Yeah.
It must have been pretty hard for these newcomers. Was there them and us?
No. Oh no. Once somebody was on your crew, they were on your crew. No, there was there weren't any difficulties at all that I'm aware of.
I suppose, like when you arrived, it was just a case of could you prove yourself?
Well,
as a good member of the crew.
The lot of my first crew had just arrived at the 5th Tanks, all of them. They're all brand new to the 5th Tanks, so we learnt the hard way. Some of them were infantrymen.
Tell me about D-Day then. I mean, I know it was D+1 when the regiment went ashore, the 7th of June. What was your personal experience of that?
It's D plus 17 hours, which was postponed to D+1 because of the weather. And we're in tank landing craft, not ships, which is 7 tanks. And of course we sat in the estuary at Felixstowe. Not all the D-Day troops came from Portsmouth. The 7th Armoured Division came from Felixstowe, which was unique. And we had to sail through the Straits of Dover. And we could see the cliffs both sides, and they thought, well, they can see us, for God's sake. What? They're going to let fly in a minute, but they didn't. And then we went round the south coast and joined up with the rest of them, and you saw these huge things floating on the water with a watchman's hut in the middle, being towed by a tug. What the hell are they? It was very rough, and the water was coming on board. And a lot of people were sick. But we had these self-heating tins, and I knew that to avoid seasickness, you filled your stomach. So I had everybody's tins, and they were seasick, and I had the kidney soup and the very creamy hot chocolate, and I was all right. But I did walk like a drunkard on the beach when we got there. And we went in the next day, and we were on the edge of the cleared area. And our crew, they were missing. They were supposed to haul back the netting, but they didn't. We had to get out, and I did some of that and got soaked up to the knees. And we went in 3 times. So the first 2 times we were too near these tripods with shells and mines on them. And we were bloody close. I was ready to jump in the water. So I don't know whether whoever was steering the bloody boat got his head down or what, but they were notable for their absence. And the 3rd time we got onto the beach, and we got out quite satisfactorily. But the landing craft next door, the first tank that went out, disappeared in a bomb crater. They did all get out actually, but that was a bit disconcerting when you're about to get out yourself. But it was perfectly quiet, and we were seen up the beach. We took all the waterproofing off, or most of it, except the cover over the exhaust, which we left on because that was a godsend. A crumble will give itself away by the exhaust shooting up in the air, so we left the cover on. And some infantry came in with, they just caught a few Germans, and we were making them double along with their hands on top of their heads, and we thought, oh, come on, this is a bit much, you don't do it that way. But that's the way they did it. And we're able to sort ourselves out and move inland just short of Bayeux. We didn't see any fighting.
What was the first encounter you had with the enemy?
We've spread out the next day and moved forward, and you were moving forward in Bakash country where you could only see there were these high banks and the small fields, and your vision was very much curtailed. But for a defender, he could hide behind any one of these hedges, just stick the barrel of the gun through, and he could see you, you couldn't see him. It was marvellous defensive country. So he did come in for a bit of a kicking.
So what was your first encounter with an infantry type defence, or did you come up against tanks? Because I know in the first day or two there were both types of engagement. Roy Dixon's told us that some of his vehicles were knocked out by armoured vehicles, but
initially there were infantry. As is well known, most of the armour, not all of it, was held back. So you came across the odd tank, but they defended very, very diligently. It was tough going, and tanks were surrounded by infantry from time to time. And I think A and B squadron were completely surrounded at one stage. And then we went to Villers-Bocage, of course. And I have the German account of Villers-Bocage and the photographs that went with it. And what was broadcast was for English consumption was mainly the German version of what happened at Villers-Bocage at the time. When you see their version backed by photographs, it was a totally different deal. The whole purpose of it was to stop the second SS Panzers going to the American front. And we did that. We stopped them. But they knocked out the CLY in the process. And we were up against Tigers in close country, tank to tank, we didn't stand a chance. But in Villers-Bocage itself, quite a lot of Tigers were knocked out. Petrol was dropped on them from buildings, or Cromwells waited in side roads for a Tiger to go by and hit it between the tracks. And quite a lot of Tigers were knocked out. But of course, a lot of Cromwells were knocked out. But, so the decision was made to pull out, and we hadn't any sleep for about 5 nights. We used our emergency packs and escape packs with tablets to keep ourselves awake. And when we pulled out, most people flopped out and went to sleep, and I was still on my feet. So it was. I was required to go to Arthur's tank, who was the adjutant at the time. Somebody got to be able to wake this lot up if it needed to be. And there was Arthur, true to type, shaving, and meticulously shaving around his moustache and washing. And some Americans came up and wanted to know what was going on, and Arthur didn't stop his shaving. And the true vision of Arthur was somebody who was absolutely immaculate. And the photograph in Wratham, which we later in the war, towards the end of the war, there's Arthur standing with his brown boots. The photograph doesn't show this, of course. Brown polished boots, suede jacket with fur collar. And Marianne remembers that coat when he used to take her to school. And he made a point of being meticulous most of the time. And it was his trademark.
Going back to just, I suppose, the aftermath of Villers-Bocage, or that moment, or that period, what was the effect of a report of a Tiger coming over the net?
eighth Hussars chap rushed through us. They said, "Tiger, tiger, tiger," and he was going back like hell, backwards. But the rest of us stayed put. But I lost there were a lot of snipers. We formed a box and they attacked us in this box, and we were in by a wood. I got out to do the necessary and got back in again, and dear old Jock, forgotten his name for the moment, the sergeant major, but he was a gentleman. He was a perfect gentleman. You never expect to find a sergeant major as a person, but he was a lovely lad. And he got out, and as he was putting his greatcoat round him and settling down, he got hit by a sniper.
There was a variety of threats, weren't there? You had the Nebelwerfers,
Yeah,
snipers,
and of course the Tigers.
It was too much for some people, wasn't it? I mean, some of the
Yes.
accounts, like Wardrop's, mentioned people who
Yes.
couldn't
And
go on.
I think there are more of those than when I look at the statistics, I can't account for how so many people went, and I think they were discreetly got rid of. I think that accounts for the vast turnover of people.
Is that, I suppose it's a combination of the fact that a lot of them had already been at war for years and the uniquely difficult circumstances of the Bocage fighting.
Well, yeah. You had to have a frame of mind. A near miss was as good as a mile. What happened yesterday, you forget. Unless you adopt that sort of attitude, you wouldn't carry on.
It's a different sort of time there, wasn't it, in the sense that people were more stoic than we would expect today, or do you think that's wrong? Do you think people were just as...
Well,
I'm sure people were just as frightened, but
you weren't going
were
to
they just as liable to talk about it, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
talk about...
About their fears or their concerns, because of what you just
No,
mentioned.
we didn't talk about it. We all knew we were scared to the living daylights out of ourselves. We're all in the same boat. We knew what it was like, and but we wouldn't let each other down. And that went not only for crews but through the regiment. And that's what made the 5th Tank such a good lot to be with.
I suppose that's the essence of camaraderie, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, they replaced the 5th COI in Normandy with the Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, and we weren't told they were coming, but in the field next to us, we were being shelled, but that was normal wherever you were. In the field next to us, all these polished tanks came in with these chaps with brass buttons shining, silly sods. And we thought, what the hell is this? And so we popped through the hedge, and they were the Inniskilling Dragoon Guards, and obviously they came to replace the COIs. And then within 2 hours, they were ordered not to talk to us. But they quickly adopted our ways, and they settled down soon enough.
Were you thought to be too subversive to
Well,
cavalry discipline?
Well, we were scruffy. Our tanks were scruffy. Well, that's it. That's the way it was in a tank. You got grease on yourself now and again, and oil and so on and so forth, despite what you did. And we hadn't shaved for some time. We normally did, but sometimes it was difficult. So it must have been quite a shock for them to see this lot in the next field. What the hell are they?
The shitty 5th.
Yes. Apparently we're known as that.
I suppose it's a badge of honour of sorts. Just after Villers-Bocage, there was a bit of deliberation at GHQ and with Monty, and some of these negative views went about, didn't they? The commander
yes,
of the division lost his job, and the commander of the brigade. And there was this idea that the division had become either shell happy or sticky. People use various phrases.
Yeah.
Was there any justice to the idea that they'd just seen too much war? The people.
No, we were too experienced. We knew that if you lost tanks and lost ground, you were losing. So you endeavoured to go forward as fast as possible, but as discreetly as possible to make ground without losing too many tanks. It's pointless in losing lots of tanks, but the official line was we can afford to lose a lot of tanks because the Americans have got Shermans on the rack, as it were. And that was the whole essence of Goodwood. Charge at them.
What was your personal experience of Goodwood?
We were the last division to come in. First of all, I heard that several of my friends had gone, and we did a recce around, and we found a whole squadron of tanks on the far side of a ridge, the far side of it, in squadron formation. Well, you can't fire in squadron formation. What the hell were they doing in squadron formation? And they'd all been knocked out by these three 88s in a farmhouse, which a German officer, they were Ack guns. And a German officer home from leave saw these Ack guns and said, for God's sake, get those guns down and fire at those tanks. And the officer said, well, I'm sorry, what's the version? I'm a flyer, flying, what's the version of...
Luftwaffe.
I'm Luftwaffe, don't fight tanks. And he said, will you fire at tank? Yeah, you fire at those tanks or I fire at you. And so they did. And they knocked that lot out. But how did that happen? We would never have done that.
Did you, people talk about motoring through the burning remnants of the 11th Armoured Division. Did you see that yourself? Did you see fields full of burning tanks?
Oh, yes. We saw it at Alamein as well. I mean, those 500 tanks, there are a lot of tanks burning. And of course, tanks became more, after Falaise, we went to the Seine and we were getting into open country again, not bocage. And we were able to use our tactics we so often use in the desert of sending a troop up, changing the lead and sending them out over a wide distance and wrecking as you went. And we made good progress like that.
Well, I think it was in the period after Goodwood that there were supposed to have been engagements in which Panthers and one or two Tigers were successfully knocked out. Pluto Ellis, I don't know if you ever... I think he was...
Heard of Pluto Ellis,
yeah,
didn't know him.
B Squadron, yeah. He allegedly knocked out a couple of Tigers with his Firefly.
Oh yeah, but the Fireflies did their stuff if they were in the right place at the right time. But a troop could be spread out over quite an area.
You mentioned before about Normandy and the fact that it cost the regiment dear. I think you mentioned that A and B squadrons were surrounded in
At one
I think
stage,
the 2nd
yeah.
and 3rd of August that was. So you weren't involved in that.
No.
But I think that was the worst single day of losses for the regiment in the war in terms
Probably
of
was.
people. Looking at the war diary, it seems to have been.
Yeah. For the most part, you kept losing your tank. And of course, when you were making progress up a centre line, in the latter days of the war, you had a troop leading, and they rotated the lead tank. And when you came to a bend in the road, you stopped, put your head round, and had a look to see if there was anything that might have a go at you. I mean, it'd be camouflaged anyway, so you were never quite sure, and then off you go again. But we did have the benefit again then of the 11th Hussars. The 11th Hussars are by far the best reconnaissance regiment of the army. They were with us in the desert, and they came back to us after Normandy.
The Great Swan.
The Great Swan.
So called.
Yeah.
I mean, a dizzying drive through the countryside of France and into Belgium, presumably.
Well, yeah. The Guards went to Brussels, we went to Ghent, and the 11th Armoured went towards Antwerp. But Antwerp itself wasn't captured for some time afterwards.
And tell us about your entry into Ghent, because that was clearly quite a seminal moment for the regiment.
Well, we're making very good progress, and one always tested any opposition to see what it amounted to, and if it didn't amount to too much, you bypassed it and left it to the infantry following along to clear up. And we managed to bypass quite a lot, and we got near Ghent, so we went the whole way. And at the south of Ghent, there's a railway embankment across the town with arches. And we got to these arches, and obviously getting through one of those arches was going to be the thing, because it was going to be covered in some way. But a civilian letters said that they thought that the anti-tank gunners at a certain entrance might be interested in surrendering, and that's when Arthur's tactics came into play.
What did he do?
Haven't we covered that?
Well, we talked about it in the pub, but we haven't talked about it on camera.
Oh, sorry. Well, some SS came strutting out, carrying a white flag with two SS and a civilian. And Arthur had a parley with them and agreed to go with them. And they blindfolded him, apparently drove him around all over the place. And he went to meet the SS general, who was immaculately dressed, and was horrified that he should be faced by somebody who said he was a major in very scruffy denims. He would only surrender to a general. So Arthur said he would go back and make arrangements. He told the SS general that the town was surrounded, and if we had to assault the town because he wouldn't retire, he would be held responsible. So Arthur came away. I suppose a dispatch rider or somebody went down to Brigade HQ and borrowed the Brigadier's hat. And the next day, Arthur went escorting the general, who happened to be the CEO wearing the Brigadier's hat. And the arrangements were made. And they went on for a long time, and clearly the arrangements were already taking place. And then a messenger came in and had addressed the CO as Colonel, wherewith the German general blew his top, but it was too late. And they retired to the industrial side of the town, and we followed behind and eventually established a crossing across the canal. We lost our second in the command, one of my tank commanders in the process. And we got a swing bridge. We managed to get a tank tow rope on it and close it. It was a railway bridge. We got 5 tanks across. And it was close industrial buildings, and there was a lot of firing going on. But the SS spent most of their time taunting us. But the next day we were supported by infantry.
What sort of taunts were they hurling at you?
I can't remember. I didn't cross.
And we've seen photos of the sort of joyous scenes in Ghent with the liberated Belgians. I suppose after all the horrors of Normandy, that was some kind of release for a lot of the soldiers.
It might be for Jackie Morgan's crew, because he managed to get into the centre of the town, and he was having a whale of a time. But I was left with my tank reversed in front of an arch where there was supposed to be a tank gun. We made a run for it at night, hoping the anti-tank gun wouldn't fire, and it didn't. And the next day we were fighting to cross the bridge into the industrial area. So some people had a lot of fun in Ghent, but I didn't even see the inside of Ghent at all. And a lot of celebrations took place in there.
There were women hurling themselves at tank soldiers, so one is led to believe.
Oh, yeah. I got pulled off a tank by a lass once. She put her arms around me and pulled me off the tank.
In Belgium, was that? Or?
That was in Belgium, yeah.
Just thinking about the last few months of the war, there were still a few hard fights, weren't there? The Germans didn't give up until...
It's very hard fights.
From your perspective, I mean, there was Retham...
Retham was an armoured train. It had 88mm guns on it and 105mm guns. And that was a nasty one to crack. And the infantry attacked it. And, you know, there were people on that field in the morning, and I thought, well, why at this stage of the war did you have to do that? Why not wait and get some artillery up? But no, we still did that silly sort of thing. And there's a beautiful picture of Arthur in the middle of Retham in his fur coat. Thereafter, of course, we lost 2 tanks either side of the centre line when they went out to see if byroads were clear, and that shattered us completely. 9 men, all desert types, Alamein types, and we felt that very hard. Not much was said about it. I found Mad Jack, and I asked him to come and have a meal with us. He was the only one who got out. He reversed his tank out, and somebody asked him, "What was it? How did you get out, Jack?" And he just grinned and said, "He, they didn't get me." No, that chap's not mad. I don't know what it is. But later on, Arthur and I had a very narrow squeak. It missed, and of course it missed, so it was as good as a mile. But in retrospect, if that was hit, Arthur and I wouldn't be here.
Just in terms of the run-up to that incident in which Sergeants Wardrop and Harris were killed, I mean, to what extent by that point was everybody anticipating an end to the war? Was it a subject of conversation among
yeah, we knew the end was coming. We didn't know how it would end. And we were making for Bremen at the time, then went on the motorbahn at 55 miles an hour. Nobody could hit us at that speed, overtaking lorries on the way to Hamburg. And then there was negotiating for a ceasefire, otherwise we'd have to bang away at Hamburg. And during the ceasefire we went into town, and Arthur and I took up quarters on the second floor building at the back of the Rat House, which was the office of the manager of Barclays Bank. And Arthur and I kept wireless watch, nobody else, just the two of us. And a little later on, in the square in front of the Rat House, there was a lot of coming and going to traffic, mostly troops, German troops being pushed back over the Kiel Canal, not letting them go south. And there was, it was interesting as he was coming. And the police came from the north, motorcycle police, with a huge Mercedes open tourer. And then it's... Sorry.
No, don't worry, Bob. Do you need a moment to...
Dönitz was in the back. And now that could only mean one thing. And we didn't know what to do. We also had berries in the air. We never got our own berries back thereafter. But that, when we saw that, we knew that was the end.
The war was over.
Yeah. It wasn't nothing was signed at that stage. And we moved up to the Kiel Canal and pushed all the Germans north of the Kiel Canal. And we had the duty to make sure they were behaving themselves, so we used to drive our Cromwells at speed. How else could we impress them? To all the local commanders and get reports from how they were getting on. Found our local brewery. And then we requisitioned boats and sailed up and down the Kiel Canal to the annoyance of the Navy.
You weren't involved in Belsen, were you, in liberating Belsen, or were you? Because some members of the regiment...
We went to Bergen-Belsen, which was near Fallingbostel, where Bill was found, and some of B Squadron deviated off our centre line and went to Fallingbostel, because some of our people who recently been captured were there as well. And Belsen wasn't far away. And Bergen was the nearest town, and a lot of wooden buildings, and it was on fire. And we had to batten down to drive through it. But nobody was too disturbed about Bergen taking a bit of stick.
I suppose if anybody had had any doubts about the nature of the Nazis at that late stage, no one was under any illusions after that.
I was in Germany in 1938, and there were concentration camps then. There was one outside Nuremberg. There was a sign to it.
One of the things you said to me in the pub, we were talking about the person who impersonated someone from the regiment, and I said reflected glory, and you said there was no glory.
No. We were all asked if we wanted to go on the victory parade in Berlin, and that was the last thing I was going on. What was there to cheer about? And when I was demobbed, I refused my medals, and they sent them through the post. And I never wore them until I went to the memorial site.
You'd said to me on the phone when we were talking about the issue of battle stress on soldiers, you said, "Oh, I had a moment at the end of the war." Is that what you're referring to with your medals and not wanting anything more?
No. At the end of the war, I was getting a little bum happy. And for 18 months after I was demobbed, I thought I was a bit of a shake, but it went eventually.
When you think back to the whole experience you had, which was clearly most of the war and the vast majority of the actions, that the 5th Royal Tank Regiment was involved in, what does the experience mean to you, looking back on it after all these years? What are the really salient things?
The salient thing is that you did what you had to do. And the war in the West was a war good against evil. It's as simple as that. The war in the East was a war between ideologies, and what the atrocities that happened there, that was a different war altogether, different scale. We had to do what we had to do.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Any other thought?
But usually they always consulted their troop sergeant. Not always, but when it was appropriate, they would do so. And when we went for Tunis, we didn't have a barrage in our front. We had the Indians in front, and they went in without a barrage. And when we went through like a whistle. They did a very good job. Don't ask what they did, but they did.
Well, Wardrop talks about that, doesn't he, as well?
And
he didn't take many prisoners, was
there
his
was
line.
we weren't supposed to take prisoners, or we would never have gone along with that. But that was the requirement. And the tank in front had been hit by an anti-tank gun. Obviously, it wasn't a big one, but it had been hit. And we came up to it, and out we got to look after them. And the officers, it was a troop leader's tank, he'd gone. He was nowhere to be seen. And the bits that fly about in the tank, and the little bits of wire, there's armoured wire. And if tanks hit, this armoured wire tends to fly about. And my field dressing was used for covering, was used on one chap. He was a bit badly messed about. And anyway, we fixed him up and called the medics, and off we went again. He got the officer got an MC for that.
Oh, really?
And I always remember Granny Horrocks and his account of the war just after the war saying, well, of course the medals used to come up from the officers with the rations, but if a medal was awarded to another rank, it went to a committee in London first, and he was often dead before he ever got it. So he didn't agree with the system either.
Sorry, I'm not getting about.
Before my time, mentioning dispatches used to get raffled in the squadron, and the squadron clerk got one. And so those songs, they're typewritten on army square line paper on a typewriter that had been bounced in a 1500 weight truck from Alamein to Tunis. And a few grotty characters amongst it, but he did it. At least he did it. So I've got the authentic document.
Okay, Mark. We're ready to just need to bash through a couple, just 2 or 3 questions really. And we're done.
So it's just a handful of questions, is it?
Yeah, we probably only need 3 questions.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. The others are the reverses are more important.
Okay, I will. You're probably going to need the first sentence from Bob, aren't you?
Yes.
Do you want that mic in
Yep.
position? So just, you only have to say a few words in response to each of these. As Graham said, it's just a few shots we're doing now just for editing purposes.
So clear. You'll need to go up a tad.
Level. Is the boom itself out?
The boom is because it's blocked by mark.
Okay.
That's it, that's out. Okay, Mark.
What did you make of the Grant tank then?
The Grant tank was a vast improvement on anything we'd had before. The biggest improvement was the 75mm gun.
Okay, that's fine,
That's
Bob. No,
great.
and you don't need to
As much
speak
as
at
you
any
need.
more length than that. Normandy was a uniquely difficult place to fight in, wasn't it? What made it so hard?
The unique feature of Normandy was the bocage. Very small fields with very high banks in between with bushes on top, which lent themselves to defence.
Even after Ghent, there were still some hard fights, weren't there?
Yes. Yes.
What was the hardest for you?
Well, of course, there was the Arnhem business, and we looked after the flank at Arnhem. But in terms of actual fighting, clearing the Reichswald forest, which was the last bit of Germany on the other side of the Rhine, that was in winter, and we had white suits on. I was missing. I burnt my hand, and I was in hospital, so I had some relief from that one.
Okay. Did you want to go around the other side then, no, Graham? Because it's just me in the shot.
Right.
So I'll stay looking at you as we were during the interview, but I'll just rattle through a good selection of the questions I asked this morning and then when we got back.
So you don't want me to say anything?
No,
No.
you don't
No.
have to say anything. Don't.
Go to sleep if you like. Okay, then Mark, we're running.
So what was your arrival in the regiment like? Did you just sort of... Did you have... Were you wearing the badge of the Royal Tank Regiment at that point, or had you not yet been sent to that regiment? What were your first impressions then of the regiment? You've said to me that the first crew for you was special. Tell me a bit about them. Tell me what happened to the members of that first crew, or the first few people you worked with on the first tanks you were engaged with. I'll do that again. Tell me what happened to those first crewmates then that you made out there in the desert. Now at that time you got the American Grant tank. What was that like compared with the others you'd been using? It had several engines linked together, didn't it? It was a rather strange beast automotively, that tank. What about the Sherman tank? Were those popular with the crews? The Sherman was referred to as the Ronson as well, wasn't it? What was the experience of being brewed up or hit in a tank like? Tell me about your impressions when you got to Tunis, when the North African War effectively was at an end. You'd been led in the regiment by this charismatic colonel, Jim Hutton. What happened to him at the end of the North African campaign? What happened to Colonel Hutton then at the end of the North African campaign? Why was being in this camp on the seashore at Homs such a difficult thing for the soldiers then? What were they expecting?
So much you don't want to gain.
Yeah. Why was being in the camp there on the coast in Libya at Homs such a difficult thing for the soldiers? What were they expecting? Was it just the living conditions, the food and things like that that made people unhappy in Homs, or was it something else? Tell me about your landing in Italy, because you went ashore at Salerno, didn't you? How did the very different nature of the Italian countryside compared to the desert manifest itself in terms of the way you were fighting in the tanks? Was this where tank commanders started having to go ahead on foot to see what the threats were before they went round a corner? What were your impressions of homecoming? How long had you been away from your family, and what was the experience of being reunited with them like? I mean, during the years that you'd been away, there'd been quite a lot of newspaper articles and newsreels about the Desert Rats, the 7th Armoured Division. Did that make a difference to the way that people looked at you when you got back? One of the young officers who was posted to the regiment shortly after it returned to England said he was the only man there who didn't have the Africa Star, and that you all spoke in a strange mixture of English and Arabic. Was it hard for the newcomers to impress the old sweats, as it were, the people who'd been through the desert? Was there a sense of them and us at all? What were the grievances then that led to this problem? What were the grievances then that led to this confrontation between Sergeant Hall and the Colonel? Sergeant Hall had been placed under arrest, hadn't he? He was in jail at that time. What happened to Sergeant Hall when this saga was over, when the Colonel was removed from command? The former CO, Colonel Hutton, had talked about the importance of the sergeants in the running of the regiment. Did the episode with Colonel Wilson, his successor, effectively show that you couldn't run that regiment unless the sergeants were on your side? Tell me about your experiences of D-Day. When you were ashore, did you run into much resistance from the Germans? For many people in the 7th Armoured Division, Villa Bocage, an inland village, became infamous. Tell me what happened there. There were a lot of recriminations after Villa Bocage, weren't there? There were a lot of recriminations after Villa Bocage, and the divisional commander was sacked. Accusations were flying around that the division had seen too much action and that it was sticky, as people used to say at the time. Do you think that was at all justified? What was it like fighting the Germans in that close country, the Bocage country? The regiment was in action for weeks on end in that close country against stiff German resistance, constantly under artillery attack. A lot of men couldn't take that, could they? When you finally broke through, I should ask something about tigers, I think, probably. There seems to have been a lot of fear of the German Tiger tank. I mean, what was the effect of a report of a Tiger coming through on the radio? When you finally broke out of Normandy, it was described as the Great Swan. What was that all about? What happened when the regiment reached the outskirts of Ghent in Belgium? Talking to some of the veterans, one gets the impression that women in Ghent were throwing themselves at the members of the tank crews. Is that what happened to you? There was still a lot of heavy fighting after Ghent. What was the most difficult fight from your personal experience? What was the moment when you realised that the war might be coming to an end? the loss of Sergeant Wardrop and Sergeant Harris must have been very difficult, because they'd been almost through the whole thing, hadn't they? And they were suddenly snatched from the regiment at the last. The loss of Sergeants Harris and Wardrop must have been very difficult, because they'd been through pretty much the whole war, hadn't they? You once said to me that you had a bit of a wobble at the end of the war. Is that when you sent back your medals?
I didn't send back my medals.
How did you describe it? You said you didn't take delivery of them.
I didn't accept them.
Okay, I'll repeat that then. You once said to me that you'd had a bit of a wobble yourself at the end of the war. Was that connected with your not accepting your medals? When you look at your whole experience of all those years of fighting in the 5th Tanks, what does it mean to you now? What are the really salient points that you remember? That's pretty much it, I would say.
Yeah.
Big range of questions.
Just for me,
Yeah.
I just want to get a slightly different, so you haven't got to do them all again, but you just pick a select, I don't know, 6 or so, and I'll just
In a different size.
different sizes, yeah. Just to establish the room a bit. Maybe a sort of opening question would be good as well.
Okay.
But then just pick whatever. Okay.
You still continuing the same
Yes,
way?
I'm just repeating a few more questions, Bob.
Okay. Random.
So how did you come to arrive in the 5th Tanks then? How did you come to arrive in the regiment? Some people sometimes talk about the Desert War as a more chivalrous or in some way gentlemanly conflict than the rest of the war. Did you experience that? What about the Sherman tank? What was that like to operate? Why was the Normandy countryside so difficult to fight through, particularly for you as an attacking force? And tell me what happened then when you got to the Belgian town of Ghent. How did the war end for you and the regiment? That's probably enough of those, isn't it?
Dennis Hewitt. Bill used to come over with his French wife every 2 years, and the memorial had started up, and I invited Dennis over and they started talking, and I pressed Bill to tell me more about this march from Breslau to Fallinghostel.
Mm-hmm.
And he started talking about it, and I'd also done some research on it. I said, Bill, nobody has written about this,
Mm-hmm.
nobody, and you really ought to put it in writing for historical reasons alone. And he did. And then when Eric Wilson came up with his book,
It's in the back, isn't it?
yeah,
It's in the back.
and I told him about it, and I edited it because there were a few things in there which Bill had got not quite right, which I was able to check
Putting
out.
that cable out from the
And so yeah, it went in as an appendix,
That's it. Thank you.
and there are 33,000 odd prisoners of war unaccounted for at the end of the war, and nobody at the time knew anything about these marches. And I don't suppose most people today have any inkling of such a thing happening. My observation was it would all upset victory celebrations, wouldn't it?
Okay, Mark. Do you want to just ask again, maybe the opening question and just two others.
Okay. Tell me about your arrival then in the 5th Royal Tank Regiment. Tell me what happened when you first got to your regiment. What happened then at the end of the Desert War when you were closing in on Tunis? How much fear was there among the Allied soldiers of the Tiger tank?
And one more question. That'd be great.
Retham, do you pronounce it? You pronounced it slightly differently to Retham. What happened then when the regiment came up against this German armoured train at Retham?
A zoot suit.
As soon as I've just carried that away, Mark,
After an accident, a zoot suit.
you can ask a couple of
When they
questions.
first arrived.
Okay,
Is that how you burnt your hand? No.
off you go.
Oh, and it's a different kind of accident.
Yeah.
Ah, yes, well,
When you march across the desert with a spade.
yes. We had someone in our squadron. We had a one-piece waterproof tank suit, which I don't think the zoot suit had a hood on, did it?
Yes, it did.
Ah, yes.
And it
Well,
had zips and would convert into a sleeping bag.
well, our chap in our squadron basically popped it in the hood without realising,
Okay, Mark. do you
while
want
on a
to
shovel recce, as we used to call them.
Well, I mean, the sacred rites of being in the desert were if you stopped, if you had to go, you've got to go. And it's a flat as a pancake, and it's no matter how far you walk, you still.
Still be visible. Mm.
Yeah.
Did you want me to?
Just a couple of questions, and this time it would be good if Bob could start the answer because he's the young man.
Okay.
Let me get this mic up.
Well, it's going to be a tricky one. Fine. Yeah, okay. Oh, Bob, yeah, should have warned you. These are only short, so
Yeah, it's
you
fine.
could even boom it if you want. Okay.
Is that clear there, is it?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
good.
that's fine. Just let me take that off. Okay.
What was the desert tea making technique?
It was a matter of making agility brew. The practice comes about because when you stopped, you never knew how long it would be. You needed to get a drink of tea fairly regularly, and so you made agility brew. You got your tin out, which with our petrol tin with perforated holes in the bottom, and stood your Dixie on top of this tin, and you put sand in the bottom of the tins and petrol, lit it, and you had a boiling water in relatively seconds, and as quickly as possible you got it in the mugs, because somebody would inevitably say move off. So we're all very adept at drinking very hot tea. And every tank and every vehicle in the 8th Army had one of these petrol tin ovens, if you like. on the
Improvised stove.
back. Yeah.
So, Graham, do you want me to just repeat a couple more?
Just repeat a couple. Yeah. Which Bob could answer. So
We're back on the kind of one sentence drill, Bob, rather
Yeah.
than the whole answer. But
Right.
I was interested in that anyway, so I asked you. But brew making is a key facet of army life. So
thanks.
back to the start again. Yeah. Did you have any choice in which regiment you joined?
Absolutely none. One went where one was sent, and if you volunteered, it was fatal.
Great answer. Next question.
Clearly, the conditions in the Normandy bridgehead were very tough, and some men couldn't take it. Did you talk about it much at the time, the risks that you were facing?
Never. We were all in the same boat. We knew what we were letting ourselves in for.
Tell me about the Cromwell tank. That wasn't very popular, was it?
When I first saw the Cromwell tank, in very crude terms, I said, what the hell is that? Because it had vertical armour on the front and on the turret, and a grown-up 2 pound a ton gun as armament.
When Colonel Hutton was dismissed from the regiment, his successor soon put people's backs up, but it would have been hard for anyone to have followed a commanding officer like Colonel Hutton, wouldn't it?
It would be very hard indeed, especially as we had just taken Tunis. We were the first into Tunis. So he would be a very, very hard act to follow.
Okay.
Yep, fantastic.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Graham.